The first sound was not an explosion, but silence. A fragile, unfamiliar silence that settled over a shattered town near the eastern plains of Ukraine, where for years the air had trembled with artillery and grief. In that stillness, an old woman stepped outside her ruined home, unsure whether to trust the quiet. Somewhere far away, a child in Russia slept through the night without sirens for the first time in months. Silence, once feared, was beginning to feel like hope. For a long time, the world had watched the war between Russia and Ukraine through glowing screens maps with red arrows, breaking news banners, numbers that rose daily. But behind those numbers were faces: farmers who abandoned their fields, students whose classrooms became shelters, doctors who worked without rest, and parents who learned to measure days by survival rather than dreams. The conflict had begun with politics and power, but it was paid for with human lives. And slowly, painfully, the world realized that no side could truly win while humanity was losing. Hope did not arrive suddenly. It came in pieces through conversations held behind closed doors, through diplomats who refused to stop talking when weapons refused to stop firing, through countries that chose dialogue over distance. The United Nations, often criticized for its limitations, became a persistent voice reminding the world of its shared responsibility. In emergency halls and long night sessions, representatives spoke not just of borders and sovereignty, but of children without schools, hospitals without electricity, and winters without warmth. Each resolution, even when imperfect, carried one clear message: the cost of continued war was too high. The United States, with its global influence, faced a difficult balance, supporting Ukraine's right to sovereignty, while recognizing that endless escalation would deepen global instability. Over time, a shift occurred. Alongside military aid and political statements, stronger emphasis was placed on diplomacy. Quiet back-channel talks were encouraged. Pressure was applied not just to resist aggression, but to imagine a future beyond it. American diplomats worked with European allies, not as commanders of a bloc, but as partners seeking an exit from a cycle of violence that threatened the entire world. Europe, closer to the pain geographically and emotionally, played a crucial role. Nations that once disagreed among themselves found unity in the urgency of peace. Germany, France, Italy, and others became bridges rather than barriers, hosting talks, proposing ceasefire frameworks, offering reconstruction plans even before the guns fell silent. Their message was simple but powerful. Peace is not just the absence of war, it is the presence of opportunity. They spoke of rebuilding cities, restoring trade, reconnecting families, and healing a continent that remembered too well the scars of past wars. Beyond the West, voices from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East grew louder. Countries that had experienced conflict firsthand urged restraint, understanding that war rarely stays contained. China emphasized stability and dialogue, aware that economic growth and global peace are deeply linked. Turkey offered itself as a mediator, hosting negotiations and prisoner exchanges, proving that geography can be a bridge rather than a fault line. Nations from the global south reminded the world that rising food prices, energy shortages, and disrupted supply chains were hurting millions far from the battlefield. Peace in Ukraine, they argued, was peace for the world. The United Nations humanitarian agencies became lifelines. Blue-helmeted peacekeepers, aid workers, and volunteers crossed dangerous roads to deliver food, medicine, and hope. Refugee camps were not just places of shelter, but spaces where dignity was protected, where children were taught, families were reunited, and trauma was met with compassion. Each saved life became a quiet argument against war. Each healed wound became proof that humanity had not given up on itself. Inside Russia and Ukraine, something subtle but powerful began to change. Ordinary people, exhausted by loss, started speaking louder than propaganda. Mothers demanded their sons return home. Veterans spoke openly about the cost of battle. Artists, writers, and teachers used their voices to imagine reconciliation instead of revenge. In Ukraine, resilience remained unbroken. But alongside, it grew a longing, not just for victory, but for normalcy, for weddings without air raid alarms, for schools without bunkers, for futures that did not begin with fear. Negotiations were slow and fragile. Ceasefires were broken, trust was thin, and skepticism was everywhere. Yet every time talks resumed, it signaled something important. Dialogue was still possible. The UN facilitated frameworks that focused on incremental progress, humanitarian corridors, prisoner exchanges, protection of civilians. These small steps did not make headlines like battles did, but they saved lives. Okay? And saving lives slowly reshaped the meaning of success. The world learned again an old lesson. Peace is not built by one nation alone. It is constructed by many hands, often imperfectly, sometimes painfully, but always deliberately. It requires pressure and patience, firmness and empathy. It demands that power be guided by responsibility and that justice be paired with mercy. The involvement of multiple countries prevented the conflict from becoming a single narrative of winners and losers. Instead, it became a shared challenge how to stop the suffering without erasing accountability. As talks deepened, attention turned to the future. Reconstruction plans were discussed alongside ceasefires. The UN proposed long-term monitoring missions to ensure stability. The United States and European partners pledged support for rebuilding infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Other nations offered expertise, labor, and investment. The idea was clear. Peace must offer something better than war, or it will not last. Jobs, homes, and dignity were recognized as tools of peace as powerful as any treaty. The most important shift, however, happened in language. Leaders began to speak less about defeating enemies and more about protecting people. Statements acknowledged pain on all sides without equating responsibility. This did not erase injustice, but it opened space for healing. Truth commissions, accountability mechanisms, and international law were discussed not as punishments alone, but as foundations for trust. Justice, it was understood, is not the enemy of peace. It is its backbone. When the fighting finally slowed, it did not feel like celebration. It felt like relief. A deep, trembling relief that spread quietly across borders. Families searched for loved ones. Cities counted their losses. The world paused, aware that peace is most fragile at the moment it arrives. But there was also determination. Determination not to waste the silence. Not to let old habits drag humanity back into darkness. In a rebuilt classroom, a Ukrainian teacher wrote the word future on the board. In a Russian town, a factory reopened, employing men who once feared they would never return home. Aid trucks crossed borders without escorts. Children learned geography not through war maps, but through stories of cooperation. The UN flag fluttered not as a symbol of authority, but of persistence, the idea that even when humanity fails, it can try again. The story of peace between Russia and Ukraine was never meant to be simple. It was meant to be human. Shaped by grief, guided by responsibility, and sustained by collective effort. America, the United Nations, Europe, and countless other countries did not impose peace. They nurtured it, protected it, and reminded the world that no nation stands alone in either war or healing. And in that quiet town where silence once felt dangerous, the old woman planted seeds in the soil again. She did not know what the future would bring. None of us ever do. But she believed, as the world had begun to believe again, that life is stronger than conflict. That dialogue can outlast destruction, and that when nations choose humanity over hatred, even the longest night can give way to morning. Peace did not arrive as a miracle. It arrived as a choice made again and again by the world together.